In the spring of 1945, as American forces pushed deeper into the French countryside, a peculiar phenomenon began unfolding in the liberated villages and towns of Alsace and Lorraine. Long lines of French women, some waiting 3 or 4 hours in the cold March rain, formed outside makeshift military camps where units of the United States Army had set up temporary quarters. The French civilians weren't seeking food rations or medical assistance. They were waiting with an almost reverential patience to catch a glimpse of what they called the soldats de couleur, the colored soldiers. Military police officers, bewildered by these impromptu gatherings, initially assumed the women were there for standard humanitarian aid. They couldn't have been more mistaken about what was truly drawing these crowds. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these French citizens were actually seeking would challenge everything both the American military leadership and the local population understood about warfare, dignity, and the power of music to transcend the darkest chapters of human history. The truth behind these long lines would expose a carefully orchestrated military deception, reveal unexpected heroes, and demonstrate how art could become the most powerful weapon of all, not for destruction, but for reclaiming humanity itself. Captain James Reese Europa Jr., named after his father, the legendary band leader who had passed during the previous global conflict, stood at the entrance of a converted barn in the village of Saint-Avold, watching the line of French civilians stretch down the muddy road. At 31 years old, Europa had inherited more than just his father's name. He carried the weight of a musical legacy that had helped define an entire generation's understanding of rhythm and soul. Europa turned to his second-in-command, First Lieutenant Marcus Webb, a trumpet player from New Orleans who had studied at the Colored Music Conservatory before the conflict began. Webb's hands were calloused not from weapons training, but from years of pressing valves on his brass instrument. "They've been out there since dawn, Captain," Webb observed, adjusting his uniform collar against the morning chill. "Word's spreading faster than our own intelligence reports. We've got maybe 40 women waiting, and I heard from Corporal Johnson that the village 2 kilometers north has started their own line." Europa pulled out a weathered notebook, its pages filled with musical notations rather than tactical plans. The 8th Air Force Division moved through here last week. They had a single harmonica player who performed for the locals. The French haven't heard real music in 4 years of occupation. 4 years, Marcus. Can you imagine living in a world without music for that long? The reality of occupied France had been more suffocating than most American soldiers could comprehend. The German forces that had controlled this region since 1940 had implemented strict cultural regulations. Musical performances were heavily censored. Jazz, with its African-American roots, had been completely banned as what the occupying forces termed degenerate art. Radios had been confiscated, phonographs and recordings confiscated or taken away. The accordion players and folk musicians, who had once filled French streets and cafes, had been silenced or driven underground. An entire nation had been forced to live in cultural darkness. Europa's unit, officially designated as the 425th Army Service Forces Band, consisted of 48 men. Every single one was a trained musician who had been performing professionally before being drafted. They had saxophonists who had played at the Cotton Club, drummers who had toured with Count Basie, pianists who had accompanied Ella Fitzgerald. The United States military, in its complex relationship with racial integration, had created something remarkable by accident. By segregating talented black musicians into their own units, they had concentrated an extraordinary amount of musical genius into single formations. Private First Class Theodore "Teddy" Williams, a 23-year-old saxophonist from Chicago, approached Europa and Webb with visible excitement. Williams had been one of the youngest musicians to ever play at the Regal Theatre, a prodigy who could make his instrument speak in ways that made grown men weep. "Captain, I just spoke with Madame Bouchard from the village council," Williams said, his breath creating small clouds in the cold air. "She's asking if we could perform in the town square this evening. She says they'll bring everyone. Every single person in Saint-Avold. She started crying when she asked, sir. Actually crying." Europa exchanged a meaningful look with Webb. They both understood what this meant. The military's official position on their unit was complicated. The 425th was technically classified as a support service band, meant to play at military functions, boost troop morale, and perform for officers' gatherings. The unspoken reality was that their existence was part of a larger compromise, keeping talented black soldiers in segregated units while still acknowledging their value to overall military morale. "What did you tell her?" Europa asked Williams. "I said I'd have to ask you, sir, but Captain, you should have seen her face. She said her daughter hasn't smiled in 3 years. 3 years old when the occupation started, 6 years old now, and the woman says her child has forgotten what joy looks like." Webb pulled out a crumpled pack of cigarettes, lighting one with practiced ease. "We'd need to clear it with Colonel Patterson. He's already nervous about us being this far forward. Combat units only arrived in this sector 2 weeks ago. There could still be resistance elements in the surrounding forests." Europa nodded slowly, but his mind was already working through the logistics. "The barn we're using has decent acoustics, better than any field tent. If we can't go to the town square, we could bring them here, 50 people at a time, rotating groups. We could run performances from 1400 hours until 2200 hours, 8 hours. We could reach maybe 400 people. 400 people who haven't heard music in 4 years, Williams added quietly. 400 people who lived under occupation, who watched their culture get stripped away piece by piece. Europa made his decision with the certainty of someone who understood that some orders were meant to be interpreted creatively. "Williams, tell Madame Bouchard we'll perform, here at the barn, starting at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Tell her to spread the word but keep it organized. We'll do shows every hour on the hour, no more than 60 people per show to keep it manageable." Webb raised an eyebrow. "And if Colonel Patterson asks questions, then I'll tell him we're conducting cultural outreach as part of the Hearts and Minds campaign," Europa replied with a slight smile. "Which is technically true. I'll send him a memo afterward. Sometimes forgiveness is easier to obtain than permission, Lieutenant." As word spread through Saint-Avold that afternoon, something unexpected happened. The line of waiting French civilians didn't just include women. Elderly men arrived, some wearing faded medals from the First World War. Teenagers came, young people who had spent their entire adolescence under occupation. Children were brought by their parents, wide-eyed and curious about what all the excitement meant. Corporal Raymond Davis, the unit's drummer from Baltimore, was setting up his kit inside the barn when he noticed an elderly Frenchman standing at the entrance. The man's clothes were threadbare but clean, patched in multiple places. His face carried the deep lines of someone who had endured far more than just physical hardship. Davis approached him with a gentle smile. "Bonjour, monsieur. The performance starts in 20 minutes. You're welcome to wait inside where it's warmer." The elderly man's eyes filled with tears as he responded in halting English. "You are musicians? Real musicians? Not just military? How you say, ceremony players?" "Yes, sir," Davis replied, touched by the man's emotion. "We're real musicians. Every one of us played professionally before the conflict. Jazz, swing, blues, the real thing." The Frenchman gripped Davis's arm with surprising strength. "My son, he played clarinet. The occupying forces, they took his instrument in 1941. Said it was contraband, that the music was corrupt. He tried to hide it, but they searched every home. They broke it in front of him. He was 14 years old. He watched them break his clarinet in the street." Davis felt a lump form in his throat. "Where is your son now, monsieur?" "He joined the resistance. I have not seen him in 2 years. I do not know if he lives." The old man's voice cracked. "But today I will hear music again. For him. For all of us who forgot what it sounds like to be human." At precisely 1400 hours, the first performance began. 60 French civilians crowded into the converted barn, sitting on whatever surfaces they could find. Hay bales, overturned crates, the dirt floor itself. The smell of damp earth and old wood mixed with the anticipation hanging thick in the air. Captain Europa stood before them, his band arranged behind him in a tight formation. The afternoon light filtered through gaps in the barn's walls, creating dramatic streaks of illumination that caught the gleam of brass instruments and polished wood. "Mesdames et messieurs," Europa began in careful French, We are honored to perform for you today. We know you have endured much. We know that music was taken from you, that silence was forced upon your lives. Today, we give it back. Today we play not as soldiers but as musicians. Today we remind you what freedom sounds like. He turned to his band, raised his hands, and brought them down in a decisive motion that launched the opening bars of Take the A-Train, the signature composition of Duke Ellington arranged for military band. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The sound that filled that barn was not just music, it was resurrection. The saxophone section, led by Teddy Williams, wailed with a passion that seemed to channel every emotion that had been suppressed during 4 years of occupation. The trumpet players, including Lieutenant Webb, traded solos that soared to the rafters and danced through the dusty air. Corporal Davis's drums provided a heartbeat that reminded everyone present that they were alive, that their spirits had not been crushed despite everything they had endured. The French civilians responded with an intensity that surprised even the experienced musicians. People were crying openly, but these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of remembrance, of reclaimed humanity. A middle-aged woman in the front row began swaying to the rhythm, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. Others joined her. Within minutes, half the audience was moving to the music, their bodies remembering how to respond to rhythm and melody. When the first song ended, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then applause erupted with such force that it nearly drowned out Europa's introduction of the next piece. They played In the Mood, the Glenn Miller standard that had become an anthem of American optimism. They played Sing, 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 with its driving percussion that made it impossible to sit still. They played traditional French melodies, rearranged with jazz harmonies that honored the original, while adding new dimensions of emotion and complexity. After 45 minutes, the first group reluctantly filed out, making room for the next 60 people who had been waiting outside. As they left, many approached the band members to shake hands, to touch their instruments, to simply look into the eyes of the men who had given them back something they thought was lost forever. Madame Bouchard, the village council member who had made the original request, approached Captain Europa with her young daughter clinging to her skirts. The little girl, barely 6 years old, was smiling, genuinely, radiantly smiling, for what her mother later said was the first time in memory. "Capitaine," Madame Bouchard said, her voice thick with emotion, "you do not understand what you have done today. Music was our soul. When they took it from us, they took part of who we were. You have given it back. You have reminded us that we are still French, still human, still capable of joy." Europa knelt down to the little girl's level. "What is your name, mademoiselle?" "Sophie," the child whispered, still shy but curious. "Sophie, would you like to touch this?" Europa held out his baton, the conductor's wand that had directed the music. The little girl reached out with tentative fingers, touching the baton as if it were made of something precious and fragile. Her smile widened, and she giggled, a sound of pure childhood delight that had somehow survived years of darkness. The performances continued throughout the afternoon and into the evening. Between shows, the band members barely had time to rest. They gulped water, stretched cramped fingers, and prepared for the next group. But none of them complained. They had all seen the faces in the audience. They understood they were participating in something far more important than a simple musical performance. Sergeant Paul Henderson, a pianist from Philadelphia, who had studied at the Institute of Colored Youth before being drafted, found himself surrounded by French children during one of the brief intermissions. They had never seen someone play piano the way Henderson did, with his whole body engaged in the music, his fingers dancing across keys that had been gathering dust in the barn's corner until the band arrived. One little boy, no more than 8 years old, approached Henderson with wide eyes. "Monsieur le musicien," the child said in careful, rehearsed English. "May I touch the piano?" Henderson smiled warmly and gestured to the bench. "Come, sit here with me. What is your name?" "Henri," the boy replied, climbing up beside Henderson with the excitement of someone being granted access to something magical. "My papa played piano before the occupation. They took our piano in 1942. Said it was needed for the military effort, but we all knew they just wanted to take it." Henderson felt a familiar ache in his chest. "Would you like to learn a simple song? I can teach you right now." For the next 10 minutes before the next performance had to begin, Henderson taught young Henri the basic melody of Frère Jacques, but with jazz harmonies that transformed the simple children's song into something rich and complex. The child's face lit up with concentration and delight as his small fingers found the notes, hesitant at first, then with growing confidence. Henri's mother stood nearby, watching with tears streaming down her face. When the lesson ended, and Henri reluctantly returned to her side, she approached Henderson and took his hands in hers. "Merci," she said simply. "Thank you for giving my son something his father cannot. Thank you for teaching him that music still exists. That joy still exists." Similar scenes were playing out around the barn between every performance. Corporal Arthur Chen, a clarinetist from San Francisco, whose Chinese heritage made him one of the few non-black members of the predominantly African-American unit, found himself answering questions about jazz from a group of French teenagers who had heard rumors of this American music but never experienced it directly. "Is it true," one teenager asked in halting English, "that jazz musicians make up the music as they play, that it is different every time?" Chen nodded enthusiastically. "That's improvisation. The foundation stays the same, the chord structure, the basic melody. But what we build on that foundation changes based on how we feel, what we hear from the other musicians, even how the audience responds. It's like a conversation, except instead of words, we're using notes." The teenager's eyes widened. "But how do you know what to play? How do you know it will sound good together?" "Years of practice," Chen explained, "and listening. Jazz is about listening more than playing. You have to hear what everyone else is doing and find your place in it. It's about collaboration, about trust. You trust that your fellow musicians will support you, and they trust you to support them." Another teenager, a young woman who introduced herself as Marie, asked a more pointed question. "Is it true that this music was forbidden in America? That there are places where musicians like you cannot perform because of your race?" Chen paused, choosing his words carefully. "Jazz wasn't forbidden exactly, but there are certainly places where we're not welcome. Venues that won't hire us, audiences that won't listen to us, critics who call our music primitive or unsophisticated. But that's changing slowly. The conflict has shown a lot of people that talent and humanity aren't determined by the color of someone's skin." Marie's expression turned fierce. "Then America is foolish. We French, we learned what happens when you try to suppress culture, when you try to decide what art is acceptable and what is not. The occupying forces tried to control our music, our literature, our cinema. They failed. Culture is stronger than any army. Your music proves this." These conversations, repeated in various forms throughout that first day of performances, began to forge connections that went deeper than cultural exchange. The French civilians and American musicians were recognizing something essential in each other: the experience of having one's humanity questioned or denied, the determination to maintain dignity and culture in the face of that denial, the profound need for art and beauty as proof of continued existence. Lieutenant Webb pulled Captain Europa aside during the dinner break between shows. "Captain, we are getting requests from other villages. Word is spreading faster than we anticipated. I've got messengers from 3 different towns asking when we can perform for them. One mayor apparently walked 15 kilometers just to ask us personally." Europa rubbed his tired eyes. The day had been exhausting in the best possible way, but he could already feel the weight of expectations building. "How many people can we realistically reach, Marcus? We've got maybe 2 more weeks before we have to relocate with the rest of the division. That's not enough time to respond to everyone who wants to hear us play." Webb pulled out a wrinkled map of the region, marked with small X's indicating villages and towns. "If we're strategic about it, we could hit the major population centers first. Metz, Nancy, Strasbourg, then work our way through the smaller villages. But, Captain, we're going to have to disappoint a lot of people. There's just not enough time." "Then we make every performance count," Europa decided. "We play longer shows. We invite more people to each one. And we start training some of these French musicians to carry on after we leave. If we can teach them the basics of our arrangements, they can continue playing this music even when we're gone." This decision led to an unprecedented collaboration. During their stay in Saint-Avold, several French musicians who had kept their instruments hidden throughout the occupation began attending the band's performances and practice sessions. They brought violins, cellos, accordions, even a battered saxophone that had been buried in a garden to protect it from confiscation. One of these musicians was a woman named Claudette Moreau, a professional violinist who had performed with the Orchestre de Paris before the conflict began. She was 38 years old, gaunt from years of limited food, but her hands remained steady, and her musical knowledge was formidable. She approached Captain Europa after a morning practice session with a proposal. "Capitaine, I have been listening to your arrangements. They are brilliant, truly inspired, but I noticed that you have no string section. In France, we have musicians with violins, violas, cellos. If you would permit us, we could join your performances. We could blend the French classical tradition with your American jazz. It would be, how do you say, fusion." Europa was intrigued but cautious. "Madame Moreau, I appreciate the offer, but we only have limited time before we have to move on. Would there be enough time to rehearse together, to learn each other's styles?" Claudette's eyes flashed with determination. "Capitaine, I have not played publicly in 4 years. 4 years. I would learn your entire repertoire in one night if necessary. Please, let us try. Give us one rehearsal. If it does not work, we will not ask again." That afternoon, 5 French string musicians joined the 425th for a practice session that would become legendary within both groups. The initial attempts at collaboration were awkward, the two musical traditions clashing as much as blending. Jazz improvisation and classical precision seemed incompatible at first, but then Sergeant Henderson, the pianist, began playing a slow blues progression. Without speaking, Claudette joined in on her violin, finding melody lines that complemented rather than competed with the jazz idiom. The other string players followed her lead, weaving their instruments into the texture of the piece. What emerged was something entirely new, classical string techniques applied to jazz harmonies, creating a sound that was both familiar and revolutionary. Private Williams, listening from the side, felt chills run down his spine. "Captain," he whispered to Europa, "this is what the world should sound like. This is what we're fighting for right here." The fusion ensemble performed together for the first time that evening in Saint-Avold. The audience response was overwhelming. French civilians heard their beloved classical instruments playing in ways they had never imagined possible. American soldiers who had come to watch their own band perform found themselves witnessing the creation of something unprecedented. One piece in particular became emblematic of this collaboration. Claudette Moreau had suggested they attempt an arrangement of La Vie en Rose, a French song that had been popular before the occupation. Henderson created a jazz arrangement, and the string players added classical flourishes. When the combined ensemble performed it that evening, something magical happened. The song was familiar enough that many in the audience knew the words and began singing along softly. The combination of voices, American jazz instruments, and French strings created a moment of such pure emotional connection that people would talk about it for the rest of their lives. It was as if the occupation had never happened, as if the divisions between nations and races had dissolved into something more fundamental, human beings creating beauty together. During the 1800 Hours show, something remarkable happened that would become legendary within the unit. An elderly Frenchwoman, dressed in black mourning clothes, stood up halfway through a performance of Georgia on My Mind. She began to sing along, her voice cracked and uncertain at first, then growing stronger. She was singing in French, her own lyrics improvised to fit the melody, words about remembering her husband, who had perished during the occupation, about surviving, about hope returning like spring after a brutal winter. The band, without missing a beat, adjusted their playing to support her impromptu performance. Captain Europa gestured for them to soften their volume, letting the woman's voice carry across the barn. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the building, including among the musicians themselves. Private Williams approached Europa during a brief break between the 19th and 20th 100 Hours shows. The young saxophonist's face showed exhaustion, but also a kind of profound satisfaction. "Captain, my lips are about to fall off, and my fingers feel like someone replaced them with sausages," Williams said with a tired grin. "But this is the most important thing I've ever done. More important than any stage I ever played on back home. These people needed this, they really needed this." Europa nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the evening chill. "I keep thinking about why we're really here, Williams. The official reason, I mean. We're supposed to be supporting the military effort, boosting morale for American troops. But this—" He gestured toward the line of people still waiting outside even as darkness fell. "This feels like the real reason. Like maybe the entire point of everything we've been through was to be here, right now, for these people." Lieutenant Webb joined them, flexing his sore fingers. "I got a message from Colonel Patterson's aide. He wants a full report on today's activities by tomorrow morning. Someone must have sent word up the chain of command about what we're doing here." "Are we in trouble?" Williams asked, though his tone suggested he didn't particularly care if they were. Europa smiled slightly. "Probably. But I'll write the report tonight and frame it as a successful morale operation targeting local civilian populations, which, again, is completely true. If the colonel wants to discipline us for being too effective at winning hearts and minds, that's a conversation I'm prepared to have." The final performance of the evening began at 2200 hours. The barn was packed beyond capacity, with people standing in the doorway and pressing against the walls to catch every note. The temperature had dropped significantly, and everyone's breath was visible in the cold air, creating a misty atmosphere that added to the otherworldly quality of the experience. For this last show, Europa made a decision that was part inspiration and part exhaustion-induced recklessness. "Gentlemen," he told his band quietly, "we're going to play Strange Fruit. I know it's controversial, I know it's political, but these people have lived under genuine oppression. They understand what that song means in ways that most Americans never will. They've earned the right to hear it." Strange Fruit was a haunting composition about racial violence in America, originally performed by Billie Holiday. It was not a typical military band piece. It was not uplifting or patriotic. It was dark, painful, and unflinchingly honest about the ugliest aspects of American society. But it was also profoundly human, a cry against injustice that transcended national boundaries and specific circumstances. The band began playing, and the mood in the barn shifted immediately. This wasn't dance music or celebration. This was testimony. This was truth spoken through instruments instead of words. The French civilians, even those who didn't understand the English lyrics that some Americans in the crowd were quietly singing, understood the emotion behind the music. They recognized the sound of suffering transformed into art, of pain channeled into something that demanded witness. When the song ended, the silence lasted nearly a full minute. Then, slowly, people began to stand. One by one, they rose to their feet in what would be recognized as a standing ovation, but it felt more like a collective act of solidarity. These French civilians, who had survived years of occupation and cultural suppression, were honoring the American musicians who had given them back their humanity, even as those same musicians acknowledged their own struggles with injustice in their homeland. An elderly French man, wearing the faded uniform of a veteran from the previous global conflict, approached Captain Europa after the performance ended. He spoke in clear English, learned decades earlier during the previous war with Germany. "Young man, I have lived 73 years. I fought in Verdun when I was 18 years old. I have seen more death and suffering than any person should witness. Tonight, you and your men did something I did not think was possible anymore. You made me believe that beauty still exists in this world, that humanity can survive anything, even this terrible conflict, even occupation, even the worst that human beings can do to each other." Europa felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders. "Sir, we just played music. That's all we know how to do." The old veteran shook his head firmly. "No, young man, you did much more than that. You reminded us who we are. You see, the occupying forces tried to erase our culture, to make us forget our identity. They took our music, our joy, our ability to celebrate life. They wanted us to become shadows, to exist without truly living. But tonight, you showed us that culture cannot be suppressed permanently, that the human spirit is stronger than any occupation force, that music is not just entertainment, It is resistance. It is survival. It is proof that we remain undefeated in the ways that truly matter. Over the following weeks, word of the 425th Army Service Forces Band spread throughout the liberated regions of France. The initial curiosity about colored soldiers had been transformed into something deeper, a recognition that these particular soldiers carried a different kind of power, one that built rather than tore down, that united rather than divided. Other villages began requesting performances. French newspapers, newly free from censorship, wrote articles about the American musicians who were healing France's soul. Requests came from mayors, from resistance leaders, from organizations representing survivors. The demand was overwhelming and impossible to fully meet, but the band did their best, performing sometimes 2 or 3 times daily when military duties allowed. The relationship between the band and the French communities they served became increasingly personal. Musicians were invited into homes for meals, modest as they were in those days of scarcity. They were introduced to families, asked to hold babies, included in wedding celebrations for couples who had postponed their ceremonies during the occupation. Language barriers were overcome through the universal language of music and the determined efforts of both sides to communicate. Private Williams formed a particular friendship with a young Frenchman named Pierre, who had been part of the local resistance movement. Pierre had lost 3 fingers on his left hand during a sabotage operation, but had survived. Before the conflict, he had been a promising classical guitarist destined for the Paris Conservatory. Those dreams had died with his fingers. They sat together one afternoon in April, watching the band practice in an open field near their current camp. Pierre had brought a bottle of wine, saved from before the occupation, which he insisted on sharing. "My sister waited 4 hours to see your first performance in Saint-Avold," Pierre said, his English heavily accented but clear. "She told me I must meet these musicians, these men who made her remember what happiness feels like. I thought she was exaggerating, being dramatic as she always does, but she was not exaggerating." Williams sipped the wine, which was excellent despite having been hidden in a basement for 5 years. "I'm just glad we could do something meaningful. Sometimes I wonder what the point of all this is, you know? The fighting, the destruction, all the loss. Music feels like the only thing that makes sense anymore." Pierre held up his damaged hand, examining it in the sunlight. "I used to be angry about this. So angry I could not sleep. I would dream about playing guitar, then wake up and remember. But then I hear your band play, and I think, maybe I lost my ability to make music, but music itself cannot be lost. It continues. It survives. People like you carry it forward. That gives me peace, somehow, knowing that what I loved still exists, still moves through the world, still touches people." "Have you thought about learning to play something else?" Williams asked gently. "Piano, maybe, or something that doesn't require—" He stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence tactfully. Pierre smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Perhaps someday, for now it is enough to listen, to know that music survived when so many other things did not." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of an approaching jeep. Colonel Patterson, the commanding officer for their sector, had arrived for an unannounced inspection. Europa and Webb immediately called the band to attention. Colonel Patterson was a career military man from Virginia, 53 years old, with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades in the field. His initial attitude toward having a military band in his sector had been one of tolerance rather than enthusiasm. He considered musicians to be a necessary morale tool, but not genuine soldiers. His perspective was about to be dramatically challenged. "Captain Europa," Patterson said, returning the salute with crisp precision, "I've been reading your reports. I've also been hearing things from the French civilian authorities. They seem to think your unit is some kind of miracle workers. I'd like to see one of these performances for myself. Can you arrange something for this evening?" "Yes, sir," Europa replied immediately. "We have a performance scheduled at 1900 hours at the village hall in Metz. You're welcome to attend." Patterson nodded curtly. "I'll be there. I want to understand what's generating all this attention. The French regional commissioner actually contacted headquarters to specifically commend your unit. That's unusual, Captain. Very unusual." That evening's performance in Metz took place in a proper concert hall. one of the few buildings in the city that had survived the fighting relatively intact. The hall had been closed for 4 years, its doors sealed by the occupying forces. Opening it for this performance felt symbolic, a reclamation of cultural space that paralleled the military liberation. The audience that night included Colonel Patterson, seated in the back row where he could observe both the performance and the crowd's reaction. Next to him sat the French regional commissioner, a distinguished man named Claude Moreau, who had spent 2 years in a prison camp for his resistance activities. As the band began their performance, Patterson watched the audience with growing fascination. These weren't people passively consuming entertainment. They were participants in something profound, a collective experience of emotional release and cultural resurrection. When the band played their jazz arrangements, people moved with abandon, dancing in the aisles despite their worn clothing and visible physical hardship. When the musicians performed a medley of French classical pieces, reinterpreted through American jazz sensibilities, grown men wept openly. During the intermission, Commissioner Moreau turned to Patterson with visible emotion. "Colonel, you must understand what your musicians have accomplished here. The occupying forces had a deliberate strategy of cultural destruction. They understood that if they could kill our music, our art, our capacity for joy, they could break our spirits completely. Physical occupation was only part of their method. Cultural erasure was equally important to them." Patterson, who had spent his entire career thinking about warfare in purely military terms, tactics, logistics, firepower, found himself struggling to fully process what he was witnessing. "Commissioner, I appreciate the cultural significance, but my primary concern is military effectiveness. Is there a strategic value to what these men are doing, beyond general morale?" Moreau's expression became intense. "Colonel, let me be very clear. The resistance movement I was part of, we fought with weapons, with sabotage, with intelligence gathering. We thought we were preserving France's future, but we were wrong about one thing. We could not preserve France's soul. We could only protect its body, its physical territory. These musicians, your band, they are restoring something we could not protect during the occupation. They are reminding us why France is worth fighting for, not just that it should be fought for. Do you understand the difference?" Patterson was silent for a long moment. "I'm beginning to," he finally admitted. The second half of the performance included a surprise that Europa had been planning for weeks. The band had learned to play La Marseillaise, the French national anthem, but arranged it in a way that no one had ever heard before. They had transformed it from a march into a jazz composition, infusing it with swing rhythms and improvisational elements while preserving its essential dignity and emotional power. When the French civilians recognized the opening bars of their national anthem, transformed but unmistakable, the emotional response was overwhelming. People stood immediately, many placing hands over hearts, many others openly sobbing. This was their anthem, banned for 4 years, now returned to them through the musical interpretation of foreign soldiers whose own country denied them full equality and citizenship rights. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room, least of all the musicians themselves. These were African-American soldiers, facing discrimination and segregation in their own military and society, playing the anthem of liberty, equality and fraternity for people who had just emerged from occupation. The contradiction and the connection existed simultaneously, creating a moment of profound shared humanity that transcended nationality, race, and all the artificial divisions that seemed to define the era. As the final notes faded, the standing ovation lasted more than 5 minutes. Colonel Patterson, still seated in the back row, found himself standing as well, applauding with genuine appreciation rather than polite obligation. After the performance, as the crowd slowly dispersed, Commissioner Moreau introduced Patterson to several local leaders. Among them was a woman named Yvette Arnaud, who ran an orphanage for children who had lost parents during the occupation and conflict. "Colonel Patterson," she said in careful English, "I brought 12 children to this performance tonight. 12 children who have known only fear and loss for their entire conscious lives. 3 of them laughed tonight. Actually laughed. I had not heard them laugh before. Your musicians did that. They gave children back their childhood, even if just for one evening." Patterson felt something shift in his understanding. He had spent 30 years in the military, focused on force protection, operational effectiveness, and tactical superiority. He had never considered that healing could be a military objective, that cultural restoration could be a strategic goal. Over the following month, Colonel Patterson became an unexpected advocate for the 425th Army Service Forces Band. He sent reports up the chain of command, documenting the strategic value of their cultural engagement. He argued that winning hearts and minds through music was as important as any combat operation in ensuring long-term stability in liberated territories. He even secured additional resources for the band, including better instruments, transportation, and scheduling priority. The transformation in Patterson's attitude reflected a broader shift happening throughout the American military presence in France. Other segregated African American units, seeing the reception that musicians received, began emphasizing their own cultural contributions. Cooks shared Southern recipes with French families. Engineers taught construction techniques while learning French building methods. The myth of American exceptionalism began to give way to something more valuable: genuine cross-cultural exchange based on mutual respect. By May of 1945, as the conflict in Europe was reaching its conclusion, the 425th had performed in over 60 French communities, reaching an estimated 15,000 people. They had played in cathedrals and barns, town squares and private homes, formal concert halls and muddy fields. Everywhere they went, they carried the same message, though it was never spoken aloud: that music was immortal, that culture could survive any occupation, that humanity persisted despite everything. The band's influence had rippled outward in ways that surprised even them. In villages where they had performed, locals began organizing their own musical gatherings. Hidden instruments emerged from basements and attics. People who hadn't sung in years found their voices again. Children who had grown up during the occupation, knowing only fear and restriction, began learning songs and dances that their parents remembered from before the dark times. In the town of Verdun, site of one of the most devastating conflicts from the previous global confrontation with Germany, the 425th performed in a cemetery where over 100,000 soldiers were buried. The performance was somber, reflective, acknowledging the terrible cost of warfare while also celebrating survival and the continuation of life despite death's overwhelming presence. Corporal Davis, the drummer, stood among the endless rows of white crosses before the performance and felt the weight of history pressing down on him. His grandfather had fought in that previous conflict, had survived the trenches only to return to a country that still denied him basic human rights. Now Davis stood in the same place, wearing the same uniform, facing the same contradictions. An elderly French veteran approached Davis among the graves. The man was missing his left arm, lost at Verdun in 1916. He spoke in heavily accented English, learned from American soldiers decades earlier. "Young man, I fought here when I was 19 years old. I saw things that no human should witness. I lost my arm, many of my friends, and very nearly my sanity. For years afterward, I could not understand why I survived when so many others did not. But today, standing here listening to your music echo through this cemetery, I think I finally understand. We survive so that beauty can continue. We endure so that joy remains possible. Your music is the answer to the question I have been asking for nearly 3 decades." Davis felt tears forming in his eyes. "Sir, I don't know what to say. We're just musicians trying to do our part." The veteran shook his head firmly. "No, young man. You are witnesses. You are testifying that humanity survives, that culture endures, that love and beauty are stronger than hatred and destruction. Every note you play is a victory over those who would destroy such things. Never doubt the importance of what you do." That evening's performance in Verdun was one of the most emotionally powerful the band ever gave. They played for an audience that included veterans from both conflicts, widows and orphans, and people who had lost nearly everything but still came to hear music. The band played with an intensity born from understanding the sacred nature of the ground they stood on. Private Williams received a letter from his mother in Chicago in mid-May. She wrote about the racial tensions back home, about the violence that had erupted in several cities, about the discrimination that continued to deny African Americans basic rights and dignities. Her words created a jarring contrast with Williams's experiences in France, where he and his fellow musicians were being treated as heroes, as liberators, as honored guests. His mother wrote, "Son, I am so proud of what you're doing over there. People here are reading about the colored soldiers who are bringing music to France, and it's making them think differently about what our people can accomplish. But I won't lie to you, things haven't changed much here. Last week, 3 colored veterans tried to eat at a diner downtown. They were refused service, told that the establishment didn't serve their kind, told this while wearing the same uniform you wear now. Your father says we have to keep fighting, that the struggle continues even after the shooting stops. I pray he's right. I pray that your generation will finally see the change we've been waiting for." Williams shared the letter with Captain Europa during a quiet evening in their current camp, located in the Alsace region near the German border. The conflict was clearly ending, everyone could feel it, but the future remained uncertain, especially for African American soldiers who would be returning to a country that still denied them full citizenship. "It's strange, isn't it, Captain?" Williams said, staring at his mother's letter. "Here we're celebrated. People wait hours to see us perform. They treat us with respect, gratitude, even love. But back home, I can't eat at half the restaurants in my own city. I can't vote in my own country's elections. The same uniform that makes me a hero here makes me a target there." Europa had been grappling with the same contradictions for months. "I've been thinking about that a lot, Williams. My father used to tell me about performing in France during the previous conflict. He said the same thing, that French people treated him like a human being in ways that Americans wouldn't. He came back to New York expecting things to change, that the respect he'd earned overseas would matter at home. It didn't. Things got worse, if anything. The racial violence of the 1920s was worse than what came before." "So what do we do?" Williams asked. "Do we just accept that this is temporary? That we'll go back to being second-class citizens once we get home?" Europa was quiet for a long moment before responding. "No, we don't accept it. But we also don't forget what we learned here. These French people, they understood something important, that culture matters, that art matters, that treating people with dignity matters. They learned it by having all those things taken away. Maybe we can bring that understanding back with us. Maybe we can use our music not just to entertain, but to change hearts and minds, the same way we've been doing here." "That sounds optimistic, Captain. Dangerously optimistic." "Perhaps," Europa admitted. "But what's the alternative? Cynicism? Despair? I'd rather be dangerously optimistic than safely resigned to injustice." Lieutenant Webb joined their conversation, bringing news that would shape the band's final weeks in France. "Captain, I just got word from headquarters. They're planning a major victory celebration in Paris once the conflict officially ends. They want military bands from every allied nation to participate, and they specifically requested that we be there to represent American forces." Europa felt the significance of this request. Paris, the cultural capital of France, liberated but still recovering from years of occupation, to perform there in the heart of the city that symbolized so much about European culture and resistance would be the culmination of everything they had accomplished. Over the next 2 weeks, as the final days of the conflict in Europe ticked away, the 425th continued their performances throughout the region while also preparing for the Paris celebration. They refined their arrangements, incorporated new pieces that would honor both American and French musical traditions, and trained with the French string musicians who had become integrated into their performances. The fusion ensemble had grown to include 12 French musicians playing alongside the 48 Americans. Claudette Moreau had taken on a leadership role among the French players, helping them adapt their classical training to the demands of jazz improvisation. The collaboration had produced arrangements that neither group could have created alone: classical rigor combined with jazz freedom, French elegance blended with American energy. During this period, something unexpected happened that would have lasting impact on several band members' lives. Corporal Davis, the drummer, had become close friends with a French family in the town of Colmar. The family's teenage son, Philippe, had shown remarkable interest in learning drums, spending every free moment watching Davis practice and asking questions about rhythm and timing. Philippe's father, a shopkeeper named Michel, approached Davis one evening with a proposition. "Corporal Davis, my son speaks of nothing but drums since meeting you. Before the occupation, there was a music school in Colmar. It closed during those dark years, but we are talking about reopening it. Would you consider staying when the conflict ends? We could offer you a position teaching music to our young people. We could offer you a home, a place where your talent is valued and respected." Davis was deeply touched, but conflicted. "Monsieur Michel, I appreciate the offer more than I can express, but I have family back in America. I have responsibilities there." Michel nodded understandingly. Of course, but please consider it. In France, we judge a man by his character and his skills, not by the color of his skin. Here, you would be simply Monsieur Davis, respected teacher and musician. I understand America does not offer the same. The choice is yours, but know that you would be welcomed here as family." Davis later learned that similar offers had been made to 5 other band members by French families and communities that wanted them to stay. The fact that these African-American soldiers were facing a choice between returning to a country that discriminated against them and remaining in a foreign land that embraced them highlighted the profound contradictions of their situation. Captain Europa called a meeting with all the band members who had received such offers. "Gentlemen, I want to make something clear. Whatever you decide, I support you. If you choose to stay in France, I will help you process the paperwork. If you choose to return to America, I'll be proud to serve alongside you for whatever time we have left. This is your decision, and yours alone." In the end, 3 members of the 425th Army Service Forces Band would eventually choose to remain in France after their military service concluded. Corporal Davis was not among them. His sense of responsibility to his family and his belief that change in America required people willing to fight for it kept him committed to returning home. But those who stayed would become part of a small but significant community of African-American expatriates who found in France the respect and opportunities denied to them in their homeland. Their conversation was interrupted by Lieutenant Webb, who approached with unusual excitement. "Captain, you're not going to believe this. General Harrison is coming to inspect our unit tomorrow." The actual divisional commander, apparently someone very high up in the French government, specifically requested that he come see what we're doing. General Marcus Harrison was a career officer from Massachusetts, known for his tactical brilliance and his progressive attitudes on racial integration, at least by the standards of 1945. His visit was scheduled for the following afternoon, and Europa spent the morning ensuring that both the band's military appearance and their musical readiness were at peak levels. When General Harrison arrived, accompanied by an aide and Commissioner Moreau, he spent the first 30 minutes conducting a traditional military inspection. He examined equipment, reviewed documentation, and interviewed individual band members about their duties and experiences. Everything met his exacting standards. Then he asked to hear them perform. The band played for 45 minutes, offering a repertoire that ranged from traditional military marches to complex jazz arrangements. General Harrison listened with intense focus, his expression revealing nothing. When they finished, he stood silently for a long moment before speaking. "Captain Europa, in 32 years of military service I have seen many things. I have witnessed extraordinary acts of courage under fire, brilliant tactical maneuvers, and remarkable feats of endurance. But I have never seen anything quite like what you and your men have accomplished here." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "You have achieved something that no amount of firepower could accomplish. You have demonstrated that the United States military can be a force for cultural preservation and human dignity, not just combat effectiveness. You have shown that African-American soldiers can be ambassadors of the highest caliber, representing American values at their best, not their worst." Europa felt a complex mixture of pride and frustration at those words. Pride in the recognition, frustration that such recognition was considered remarkable rather than expected. General Harrison continued, "I am recommending your entire unit for commendation. More importantly, I'm going to personally ensure that your work here is documented and shared throughout the military command structure. What you have proven is that segregated units, despite the injustice they represent, have developed unique capabilities that integrated units might not possess. You have concentrated extraordinary talent into a single formation. That concentration has created something powerful." Commissioner Moreau stepped forward. "General Harrison, with your permission, I would like to add something. The French Provisional Government would like to award the Croix de Guerre, our highest military honor, to Captain Europa and to recognize his entire unit with a citation from the French Republic. We believe their cultural contribution to the liberation of France deserves formal acknowledgement." The general nodded his approval. "Captain, you and your men have done more than play music. You have demonstrated what is possible when we recognize the full humanity and dignity of all soldiers, regardless of race. You have shown what America could be, even if we are not there yet." The award ceremony took place 2 weeks later in Paris, just days after the formal conclusion of the conflict in Europe. Captain Europa and the entire 425th Army Service Forces Band stood in formation in front of the Hôtel de Ville, Paris's historic city hall. Thousands of Parisians gathered to watch as French officials pinned the Croix de Guerre on Europa's uniform and presented the citation to the unit as a whole. But the most meaningful moment came after the official ceremony ended. A group of French musicians, members of the Paris Conservatory who had survived the occupation, approached the American band members. They carried their instruments, violins, cellos, clarinets, instruments that had been hidden for 4 years to protect them from confiscation. The leader of the French musicians, a violinist named Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, spoke in English for the assembled crowd. "For 4 years we could not play together. Our instruments were contraband. Our music was forbidden. We survived, but we did not truly live. Today we wish to thank our American friends not with words, but with music. We wish to play together, French and American musicians, as equals and as friends, to celebrate not just the end of occupation, but the restoration of culture itself." What followed was an impromptu concert that would be remembered for generations. French classical musicians and American jazz players found common ground in melodies that transcended their different traditions. They played together for 2 hours in front of the Hôtel de Ville, creating fusion compositions that had never existed before and might never exist again in quite the same way. Parisians danced in the streets. People laughed and cried and celebrated not just victory over occupation, but the return of beauty to their lives. Private Williams found himself playing saxophone in harmony with Rousseau's violin, creating a conversation between their instruments that needed no translation. During a brief pause, Rousseau leaned over and said, "Your music saved us. Not in the dramatic way, not from danger. But you saved our spirits. You reminded us that we are human beings, not just survivors. This is a debt that France will never forget." As the sun set over Paris that evening, the music continued. The 425th Army Service Forces Band, joined by their French counterparts, played until their lips were sore and their fingers could barely move. They played because they had to, because the music demanded to be released, because this moment of genuine human connection was too precious to end prematurely. Captain Europa stood to the side during the final songs, watching his men perform with French musicians who had become friends. He thought about his father, about the previous conflict, about all the African-American soldiers who had served with distinction, only to return to a country that denied them basic rights. He wondered if this time would be different, if the lessons learned in France would somehow translate to change back home. He didn't know the answer. History would prove both his hopes and his fears to be partially correct. The post-conflict years would bring both progress and resistance, advancement and backlash. But in that moment, watching his men create beauty in partnership with French musicians, Europa allowed himself to believe that music could change the world, one performance at a time, one heart at a time, one restored spirit at a time. The 425th Army Service Forces Band returned to the United States in September of 1945. They were officially disbanded shortly thereafter, the musicians sent home to resume their civilian lives. Captain Europa returned to New York, where he became a music teacher and community organizer, using the lessons he learned in France to advocate for civil rights and cultural preservation. Private Williams went back to Chicago and eventually formed his own jazz ensemble, playing venues that had been closed to African-American musicians before the conflict. Many of the French communities that had hosted the band's performances kept in touch with individual musicians for decades. Letters crossed the Atlantic regularly, sharing news, expressing gratitude, maintaining connections forged during those months of cultural restoration. When civil rights demonstrations erupted in the United States during the 1950s and 60s, some French citizens who remembered the band wrote letters to American newspapers testifying to the dignity, talent, and essential humanity of the African-American soldiers who had helped restore France's soul. The story of why French women waited hours to see colored soldiers became part of both French and African-American historical memory. It was a story about the power of music to transcend occupation and oppression. It was a story about human dignity surviving the worst that history could inflict. It was a story about unexpected heroes whose weapons were instruments, whose ammunition was melody, whose victory was measured not in territory captured, but in spirits restored. The truth that had drawn those long lines of French civilians was simple but profound. They came not because American soldiers were exotic curiosities, but because those particular soldiers carried something precious that had been stolen from them. They came because music had been banned, joy had been suppressed, and culture had been targeted for destruction. They came because these African-American musicians, themselves facing discrimination and injustice, understood what it meant to have your humanity denied and still insist on its expression. They came because the 425th Army Service Forces Band offered not just entertainment, but proof that beauty could survive darkness, that culture could outlast occupation, that the human spirit remained unbreakable no matter how much force was applied against it. In the years that followed, some of the orphans who had attended those performances in France grew up to become musicians themselves. Some of the teenagers who had danced to American jazz in liberated villages went on to study music formally, carrying forward the tradition they had encountered during those crucial months. Some of the elderly French men and women who had wept at hearing music again after 4 years of silence told their grandchildren about the colored soldiers who had given them back their souls. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.